Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it a minute or two for more people to join now that we've gone live. Okay, I think most of the people that were waiting to come in have been admitted, so we'll get going. Thank you for joining this E3G media briefing, looking at what came out of last week's General Assembly discussions, New York Climate Week discussions, and what's coming next. My name is Alden Meyer. I'm a senior associate with E3G based in Washington, and I'll be moderating this discussion. Joining me are two of my E3G colleagues, Laura Sabogal Reyes, who is an expert on finance, country platforms, and other details of this process, and Leo Roberts, who's an expert on energy and the shift away from fossil fuels to clean energy. So with no further ado, let me just talk about the housekeeping. Each of us will make some brief introductory remarks trying to frame the issue, what we saw coming out of last week, what we're looking forward to in the next months. We will then open it up for your questions. And if you have a question, you can either put it in the Q&A or you can raise your hand and I will recognize you when we get to the discussion. This is being recorded and will be available, and it's on for later viewing or distribution to your colleagues. It will be on our website, and it is also on the record. So let me just start with some of the key takeaways from last week. I think we were concerned going in that with what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening on Ukraine, US, China, the presidential elections, the debt crisis, so many other geopolitical stresses that climate might sort of fall off the top tier of issues. The good news is that didn't happen. Climate was featured in a number of the key leaders' speeches, President Lula, President Biden, Prime Minister Starmer, Kenyan President Ruto, Samoa's Prime Minister, and others. Clearly, it's not the top tier geopolitical. The urgent crises in the Middle East, Ukraine, and other flashpoints are taking up most of the bandwidth and energy, but it is clearly on the agenda. We saw at the very beginning of the week the agreement on the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future. Climate had good representation in there. It was somewhat disturbing that we had to fight to reinsert language from the UAE COP28 decision on the global stocktake, particularly on the fossil fuel energy sector transition that had fallen out of a previous iteration of the negotiating text, and we had to fight to get that in. We didn't get a lot in there to elaborate on how that would be implemented, and Leo will speak to that in a minute about some of the next steps on that front. But that was a very high level decision and set of commitments by leaders, and it gives us a basis going forward. I mentioned some of the speeches of UNGA, I think from the Secretary General's initial speech, followed by President Lula and a number of others that I mentioned. You saw climate featuring the need to address this issue urgently, the impacts that are spreading around the world, the link with climate security and instability, as well as the opportunities in the climate crisis for jobs, for prosperity, for creating a better future for people. So I think there's a through line there in a number of the speeches, which gives us something to build on. We did see, obviously, climate finance was front and center over the course of the week. I'll say a bit more on the new collective quantified goal for climate finance in a minute. That's the centerpiece of COP29, and Laura will say more about some of the broader finance landscape on issues like MDB reform, debt relief, private capital mobilization, country platforms, et cetera. But this was a very intense focus of discussions last week among leaders, among ministers, the business community, NGOs, and others, and that will tee us up for what's coming next. We saw climate impacts and the need to address them and build climate resilience front and center in the discussions as well. Last Wednesday, you had the high-level meeting on sea level rise. You had a high-level ministerial roundtable on scaling up adaptation finance and delivery. You had a number of other events around town, which sort of kept this issue high on the radar screen. And of course, with what's happening around the world in terms of typhoons, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, et cetera, this is building political pressure for action on the resilience front, and that's something we can speak to more. On the centerpiece of the Paris Agreement next round of the next round of nationally determined contributions and keeping 1.5 Celsius alive, as people say, there was a high-level event by the Troika of presidencies, the UAE, Azerbaijan, and Brazil, last Thursday. The good news is the rhetoric was quite stirring. Everyone committed to 1.5 C. Everyone committed to putting forward ambitious NDCs in the coming months. We got a little more clarity on the timing from some countries, such as the UAE, Azerbaijan, and Brazil, the UK and US, all indicating theirs would come either at COP29 or by the end of this year. That was the good news. The bad news is there was very little new there about how these countries intended to live into the global stocktake decisions last year in Dubai, particularly how they intend to implement the transition away from fossil fuels. And Leo will speak more to that in a minute. But I was struck by the fact that the Troika presidencies said nothing about reforming their current intentions to expand production and export of fossil fuels. All three of them have plans to dramatically scale up investment in that sector. Of course, they're not alone. My own country, the United States, along with Leo's, the UK, Norway, Australia, Canada, are all scaling up production and export of fossil fuels. Collectively, they're responsible for over 50% of the expanded fossil fuel production over the coming decade or so. So this is a widespread problem. There's a huge disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality when it comes to claiming you'll be 1.5 C aligned and then not meeting one of the central tasks for 1.5 C alignment. We saw New York Climate Week in full tilt. There were 900 events, I'm told, which is a 50% increase over the previous year. You saw not just ministers and leaders, but business, states, cities, CSOs, think tanks, and others interacting all across Manhattan and some of the outer boroughs as well on these events. It was a rich environment. I haven't fully digested what came out of that or seen a top line summary, but there was a lot of discussions going on. And of course, a lot of private bilaterals going on, including the Secretary General's meeting with over 35 leaders, at each of which climate was raised in the conversation, I'm told. There was a ministerial engagement on the NCQG post-2025 climate finance goal last Friday. The good news is that ministers are starting to engage on the political crunch issues here of the quantum of that commitment, the scope and scale of it, the contributor base issue, broadening the set of countries that are expected to provide climate finance, some of the access issues that are of particular concern to the LDCs and the small island states, et cetera. Chris Bowen from Australia and Yasmin Fuad, two ministers from Australia and Egypt, have been tasked by the COP29 presidency to conduct ministerial consultations on this. This was a key step in that process. The ministers, I think, are still getting up to speed on the issues, some of the political dynamics, but I think they're starting to realize they are the ones on the hook to deliver a deal on this at COP29 in Baku. The negotiator level delegates are hopelessly deadlocked, and it's going to take political decisions by ministers and even leaders to make progress on that issue. So that's what came out of last week. Let me just say a few things about what's coming up next before handing it over to Laura. On the NCQG front, there will be a ministerial discussion next week in Baku. sort of 2.0 on what happened in New York last Friday. There will also be a pre-COP ministerial looking at the broader range of issues. So how does the global stock take decision in Dubai inform the next round of NDCs? Can we expect them to be economy-wide, including all greenhouse gases, addressing the fossil transition, et cetera? There will also be a host of other finance issues being discussed and teed up for the COP, including the developed country commitment to double adaptation finance to $40 billion by next year, and living into the new loss and damage fund, operationalizing that and scaling up finance from the initial $800 million pledge. So we'll see how much progress is made. That will be a key test for Azerbaijan, the incoming presidency, how far they're able to get next week. Then right hard on the heels of that, you have the IMF World Bank annual meetings in Washington the week of October 21st. Laura will speak more to that, but there's also some very important G20 ministerial meetings that week. Brazil will be convening a joint meeting of finance, climate, and foreign ministers coming out of the Task Force Climate, TF Clima, process, looking at the road forward and the need to transform financial architecture to ramp up both public and private finance for climate mobilization, as well as the whole national transition plan, investment planning process that Brazil has put a lot of focus on. There also will be a separate finance ministerial of G20 finance ministers. That will be an important moment. Laura will say a little bit more about that. And then, of course, we're all looking forward to the G20 Leaders Summit in Rio on November 18th and 19th, which coincides with the second week of the COP in Baku. And so there's a lot of discussion in corridors about whether that meeting could provide some political guidance back to ministers in Baku to break any last-minute deadlocks in the negotiations there. And that could come either out of the G7 communique, G20 communique itself, or it could come out of some of the bilateral discussions on the fringes of the G20, especially if there's a meeting between the US and China on this issue, when hopefully the results of the US election will be clear. So that's the G20, COP29. I've mentioned the NCQG and the broader climate finance issue. There will also be obviously unveiling of some of the initial NDCs by then or during that meeting. There will be important discussions on the just transition and mitigation work programs and their mandates going forward. And there will be a whole host of sectoral initiatives being discussed. The Azerbaijani presidency has put forward 14 separate initiatives on energy, agriculture, nature, and a very interesting one called the Baku Initiative on Climate Finance, Investment, and Trade, trying to unify across those platforms. So that will be an important part of the puzzle. And then finally, just a comment on COP30. Brazil is already starting to think about the agenda there, and we know that the NDCs are not going to add up to what's needed to keep 1.5 on track. So how do we deal with that? We need to look at sectoral initiatives, subnational action, and of course, continued finance transformation. So that discussion is already starting as well, even though we're not yet at COP29. Let me end there and turn it over to Laura, and then after she and Leo have given their opening remarks, we can go to Q&A. Laura.
Thank you, Alden. I think that was a very comprehensive scene setter. I think on finance, there was quite a lot of movement. I don't think there's a need, and I'm sure many of you will have some questions on the NCQG. There was kind of quite a lot of movement around it as we didn't make so much progress in Bonn, but I will focus more on the broader picture. As Alden was mentioning, I think a lot of progress has been made and has been driven across different fora. A lot of it has, I think, been made possible by the Task Force Clima that has been tackling the issue across the board, because we know that for mobilizing the trillions that we need, we're going to have to essentially have a mosaic of solutions, right? So we're going to have to look at the questions of debt. We're going to have to look at questions of taxation, so new revenue. also how we can optimize the broader public development bank ecosystem. So not only the MDBs, and also how we can make sure that the system overall is reformed so that the flows can go where they have to go, and that's more on the macro side, right? So like really like central banks and the regulators around it. So I think in terms of progress that was made, and that is I think definitely worth highlighting. We know that the replenishment of IDA is happening soon, and Denmark came out with a very interesting announcement for its replenishment, 40% higher than its previous contribution. I think that's something to definitely watch out for, because that is one of the main issues that needs to be called in order to rebuild some of the trust that has been, let's say, becoming wider and wider between developed and developing countries. And we also saw some good, I would say, statements from the new Prime Minister of the UK, from Starmer, and same from the US Treasury. So that's something to watch out for. Another thing that happened that is definitely worth mentioning is that Prime Minister Motley took over the presidency of the B20, and the B20 also came out with a statement, a leader statement that was endorsed by quite a few different countries, calling out for an SDR, rechanneling issuance of special drawing rights, which, as you know, has also been getting quite a lot of traction and has been, let's say, a slow burning conversation. But I think especially in UNGA, with this call and with the amount of countries that are behind it, is getting some movement. Of course, as Alden was saying, there are some considerations there, as that will require all countries to sign off on it, and of course we have a few elections coming up that will be crucial. Nonetheless, it is definitely something worth mentioning. I think another thing that happened that is, of course, that drove a lot of the conversation was the Pact for the Future. In terms of text, I think there are good and there are bad things. I think there's a lot of good text related to tax reform, and that's also another area where we're seeing quite a lot of progress being made. There's quite a few different initiatives that are ongoing. So we have on the one side the convention under the UN, but then there's also the push under Brazil with the G20 presidency for the billionaires tax. And then we also have independent initiatives, such as, for example, the task force that is driven, the Global Solidarity Levies task force that is championed by Kenya, France, and Barbados. So I think in general, the balance out of UNGA is quite good for tax. There was a lot of discussions. There's a lot of movement. Of course, tax, as you know, it's a sovereign issue, so it will require more in order to actually reach what we need to reach, which is an agreement. So either if we want to go for one of the taxes available in the context of the Global Solidarity Levies task force, that is like a financial transaction tax that some countries have already implemented, or whether that's a maritime or whatever option, of course, that will require that different countries sign up to it, and that there's this coordination. But I think at least there's a lot of movement. And what is very, I think, what gives me hope is the fact that there's different players in different fora pushing for it, and that the UNSG is also very much involved in this discussion. I think on the question of debt, we haven't made as much progress, but I think it's better than where we were before. I think that is a very important issue, because we cannot talk about mobilization of trillions if there is no fiscal space. So countries need to be able to absorb that money in order to finance their transition. In that sense, there was some movement around the debt sustainability framework, which, as you know, is a tool from the World Bank and the IMF that is used in order to assess countries and let's say their credit worthiness. And that, of course, is a discussion that is going on in terms of its reform in order to facilitate more investments into climate, as the sums are quite significant that need to be mobilized. So there were discussions around it. There is currently this review that is underway by the World Bank and the IMF. So it's quite useful to also have other players discussing it. And I think one of the main was Barbados the Bridgetown Initiative did an interesting event with Systemic around that. And we also know that the expert review of that nature and climate, championed by Colombia, Kenya, France, and Germany, will be coming out. The independent experts are coming out with a preliminary report with some recommendations, again, on the debt sustainability framework and how it can be reformed. So all of this is quite helpful, or it's quite useful, because it will help, let's say, the push that Alden was mentioning on the way to the task force climate meetings and also on COP29, because that question is a big question mark in terms of the NCQG too. So how do we actually integrate and consider it? And I think in terms of the MDBs, the MDBs have progressed quite a bit. There is still work to be done. Although, of course, I would say in terms of the evolution agenda, the World Bank, as we know, has made significant progress, and the other regional MDBs are also in the process of evolving institutionally, deploying new resources, and collaborating more closely. One thing to note was that the discussion of country platforms, or next generation country platforms, is starting to show some fruits. Colombia announced a JETP-like country platform that was discussed on the sidelines of the New York Climate Week, and we are keen to see further details in the run-up to COP16 that Colombia is also hosting, also building off all of the discussions that have been happening across different fora and also Task Force Clima. We expect also that Brazil will soon release its country platform, so I think it's quite good to see some movement on that front. However, I think in terms of the MDBs, there is still more space for implementing fully the recommendations of the Capital Adequacy Framework Review in order to unlock further resources. So I think that's also something that we are keen to see how it's going to happen. And now that we're going to have the annual meetings in DC, what the bank will communicate, and also what is the landscape in terms of the IMF and its evolution, which so far hasn't happened in the same way that has happened, for example, for the World Bank. So I think with that, I will send over to, give it back to you, Alden, and keen to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was very comprehensive in a short amount of time, covering a lot of ground. So we will go to Leah Roberts next to discuss the fossil fuel and energy aspects of the agenda. And I already see there's one question in the chat. If you have additional questions, please put them in there. And then as soon as Leo's done, we'll open it up and go to the Q&A and discussion. Leo.
Thanks, Alden. So I won't repeat what Alden said at the start relating to energy in the interest of time, but I think it's worth flagging that the energy transition headlines from the various events in New York are kind of a microcosm of the wider landscape and climate action, which is to say that coming out of New York, there's just enough reinforcement of previous commitments and the momentum to send the signal that the COP28 energy package is still a priority, it's still alive. But overall, there's a deeply worrying lack of coordinated political leadership and engagement to turn this into something concrete to actually deliver on it. I think it's worth saying that the Pact for the Future, reaffirming the COP28 commitments, which is to say transitioning away from fossil fuels, tripling renewable energy by 2030 and doubling energy efficiency, and language on coal phase out, is extremely positive. As Alden said, the negotiations were difficult. Getting that back in is a positive sign that countries are committed to that language. But the pact was very weak on delivery mechanisms or measures, so concrete ways to turn this into reality. I think looking forward, we would expect to see the text reflected again at COP29, but we really do need to see some movement on how to turn this into reality. The Global Renewables Summit brought together governments, the renewables industry, financial institutions, civil society, and tried to put the tripling of renewables firmly in the spotlight, which it did really well. It provided a good space for countries to discuss how this might be translated into NDCs, which was really helpful, as it's something that we've seen is missing from the NDC space so far. But what needs to happen to get the money moving to ensure the tripling goal is met was discussed, but there wasn't really much clarity on how this could happen. There were no major announcements or commitments made from the countries present. So I think, again, this was another signal of momentum in the right direction, but it didn't provide nearly enough clarity from governments on how they plan to get there. I think more broadly, there are two worrying trends which I would flag. One of them is a lack of coherence around how countries are linking ambition on the global energy transition through to financing. And this links to some of the pieces that Laura set out. So in terms of architecture, what mechanisms exist to finance the energy transition? Are they delivering what's needed, or are they all relating to ambition and target setting rather than actually getting money to the right places? The quantum, is there enough energy transition finance to deliver a 1.5 degree aligned transition in time? And the quality of finance. So is the finance that's available sufficiently concessional, and does it avoid saddling global south countries with more debt? It just felt like these were issues which were dodged or circumvented by many of the speakers. I think the second trend, which is worth flagging, is that there was really an insufficient signal of a key point around the energy package, which came from COP28, which is that it's quite clearly a package, not a menu. 1.5 degree alignment means we need to deliver on all the component parts. So again, that's tripling renewables by 2030, doubling energy efficiency, but also phasing out fossil fuels and rapidly accelerating the exit of a coal exit, which means 2030 for OECD countries and 2040 everywhere. And there was just generally fragmentation where you found some leaders and some speakers referencing some parts of this, but not others. And I think what we need to see going forward is much more tightening of that and recognition that all countries need to be working together to deliver that collectively. I guess I'd finish by saying there's still time for a core leadership group of ambitious countries to step up and provide clear, aligned leadership around NDCs, working through into next year, but also in advance of the forthcoming G20 and COP29. This is going to be a finance COP that we're heading into, but that doesn't mean that energy is no longer relevant. In fact, it makes it extremely important that it's not dropped. So we need to see much more coordinated diplomatic and political leadership from a set of countries on the energy issues. And ultimately, we need to see a set of NDCs in Brazil at the end of next year, which collectively deliver on the whole energy package. And this is going to require serious political leadership and diplomatic coordination, which wasn't in evidence in New York, I think, by our assessment. I'll stop there and leave some room for questions.
Thank you so much, Leo and Laura. I see we already have 3 questions in the chat in the Q&A function. If you have more there, please put your questions there. Also, if you'd like to ask a live question of any of us, you can raise your hand. So the first one is from Jean Richard from Radio France International. It's a multi-part set of challenging questions. I'll try to address some of them and then see if Leo and Laura want to weigh in. On the Azerbaijani presidency, I think it's fair to say that they are green. Not in the usual sense of the term, but in terms of stepping up the learning curve. It's a work in progress. They are coming up it and building capacity. They are getting assistance behind the scenes from the current UAE presidency as well as the incoming Brazilian presidency. But of course, neither of those two countries want to step on Azerbaijan's parade. It's sort of their show. I think, we did see them start to drive some ministerial engagement last week in New York, both on the NDC front and on the NCQG front, which is the centerpiece of their COP. As Leo said, it is a finance COP. I think we will have more indicators of how much progress they're making coming out of the NCQG ministerial and the pre-COP ministerial next week in Baku. So stay tuned for that. But they clearly are having challenges. They are coming up the learning curve on both the substance of some of the issues as well as the geopolitics and how to drive a bargain at the end game of the COP at the end of the second week. The slow progress in the talks being linked to the uncertainty over the next U.S. president, there is some of that. And clearly, I think some countries are holding back on making final decisions on their positions on issues like the NCQG until they know the results of that election. But these were always going to be tough negotiations. These are huge issues. They're not just substantive issues in the sense of the need to ramp up climate finance and the challenges for developed countries like the Europeans, the UK, US and others in raising their game in very tough fiscal and political landscapes. But they are also geopolitical discussions. The issue of the contributor base, and should it be expanded from the Annex 1 group of countries from Rio in 1992 to include the Gulf states, Singapore, especially China, and others. That is both a substantive issue and the need to raise the scale of climate finance, but it's a deeply geopolitical one, which goes to the division between developed and developing countries in the regime going back 30 years. So yes, the US election is a complicating factor. It's one more level of uncertainty, but there are others in the world as well. What's happening in the Middle East by the time we get to Baku? What's happening in terms of additional major events like Hurricane Helene and the flooding and wildfires in Brazil? What's happening in Ukraine? What's happening with fiscal solvency of some of these countries that are deeply in debt and on the brink of insolvency? There's a number of geopolitical challenges that make this difficult. The US election uncertainty is clearly one of those. So I will leave it there and see if Leo or Laura want to amplify any of that in terms of the other international tensions. I think I've covered a lot of the landscape, but anything you want to add? Okay, we can go to the next question from Will on the chances of loss and damage. I think it will be included as a part of the COP29 agenda in the sense of moving forward, operationalizing the loss and damage fund that was created in Sharm el-Sheikh, and for which initial pledges of $800 million were made last year at COP28. There is strong resistance from the US in particular, but some of the other developed countries as well, to having an explicit loss and damage finance mobilization sub-goal in the NCQG. There's a little less resistance to having an adaptation goal, but loss and damage, as many of you know, has been a particularly fraught space over the 30 years of these negotiations, because for some countries, particularly the US, it is seen as a proxy for unlimited liability for historical emissions and the demand for compensation or reparations, which the US and Europeans and others reject. So if I had to put on a crystal ball, I doubt there will be an explicit loss and damage carve out in the NCQG, but I think there will be progress on stepping up mobilization of resources for loss and damage. On the third question from Michael, I don't know, Laura, can you take a crack on that, on the role and size of private finance versus public money, maybe both in the NCQG and in the broader financial landscape?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, it's definitely a discussion, but as Alden was saying, I think right now the core of the discussion is really on the contributor space and let's say that public side of the equation. Who's going to contribute? Where is that money going to come from? Whether that implies opening the convention again, because of course when it was negotiated originally we had these annexes and that was pretty fine, right? So if we want to, what are the implications there, legally speaking, or whether we can create some sort of like layer that is voluntary and whether that's acceptable or not. So I think as of now, and Alden, please feel free to correct me if you don't agree, I think that's where the core of the discussion is. I think there is, of course, a discussion of how that money can help mobilize additional private resources and what are those resources or what is the proportion, right? That is on the NCQG. I think in general, the discussion on the private capital mobilization is very much tied to national conditions being enabling and essentially allowing that money to flow in, right? And that is more on the size of the, I would say, country platforms or the reforms that country need to implement or integrate in their frameworks in order to make that environment attractive for private financiers. So I would say that, let's say, outside of the UNFCCC negotiating block and more, on the national front, I think there is some progress that is being made. But again, this will very much depend on the different conditions in different countries, right? And in order for this to be sustainable, that some of that will need to be brought in through blended finance mechanisms. But ideally, as time goes on and as countries go through the process of determining their transition pathway and developing the regulatory or reforming the regulatory framework that they need in order to create that, let's say, attractiveness, that there will be more capital, private capital flowing into those countries and those jurisdictions.
Thanks, Laura. No, I agree with all that. I mean, on the NCQG itself, I think there's going to be two components. There's sort of a core support component, which is kind of analogous to the current $100 billion commitment. And remember, that's a mix of developed country, public sector finance, multilateral development-backed finance, and private sector finance that can be directly linked to being mobilized by that public sector finance. So I think that will continue. I think there may be some pushback from developing countries on how exactly to score all of that. They're not exactly happy with the way that the OECD has done the accounting on that for what counts, and grants versus concessional finance versus market finance, et cetera. But I think it's clear that private finance will be a piece of that core support goal in the NCQG. On the broader landscape, there's what's called the Article 21C discussion, which is looking at how public and private finance overall contributes to the achievement of the Paris goals on decarbonization and on building resilience. And there, some of us were in Glasgow when Mark Carney announced there was $130 trillion of assets under management ready to be deployed in the climate battle. And of course, the problem is we've seen very little of that move off the sidelines into actual deployment. So that will be at the core of the Sharm el-Sheikh dialogue in Baku on Article 21C and broader finance mobilization. It's clearly at the core of a lot of the discussions that Laura mentioned around blended finance and private capital mobilization that are going on, loan guarantees, those kind of things. So private finance is definitely on the table. I think what will be rejected by developing countries is any sense that mobilization of private finance gets developed countries off the hook for scaling up public finance. And that's where the fault lines are going to be. How much political will is there in Washington, Brussels, London, Berlin, Tokyo, other capitals to actually put real public finance money on the table? The next question I think also goes to you, Laura, from Juan on the UN tax convention and the role that can have on environmental investments if it's implemented.
Alden, but I see that there's a question also on country platforms that ties quite nicely with what we were just discussing. So if Juan doesn't mind, perhaps we do that first.
Maybe start with that one and then maybe pivot to Juan's. Yeah, that'd be great.
It's from Amy, and can you expand upon the country platform strategy and how that improves upon the JET piece, and what is the role of private sector investors in achieving some of these climate finance goals?
Go for that one.
No, absolutely, and I think here I will ask my colleague Leo to complement. So as we know, there has been already a flurry of JET piece that are currently ongoing, and they have faced some issues across the board. So I think now the push is to really roll out next generation country platforms. I think the title is up to be decided still, but it's really learning a little bit from what happened then, right? Where we had these very big announcements, but perhaps not the amount of legwork done beforehand in order for these announcements to actually, not only depend on those announcements, but also bring different players to the table, including private financiers. So I think that is what's happening right now. And for example, what is happening right now with countries like Colombia is that Colombia is very much charting its decarbonization trajectory, also its resilience trajectory, and on that basis, let's say, creating investment plans and detailed project sectoral pipelines that will enable them to interact with donors, philanthropies, private sector, and all of the relevant financiers. And in that sense, it's building on the experience of the JET piece, but very much from a perspective of preparing the pipeline of projects that is required and really approaching it from a holistic and programmatic approach in order to be able to match the different sources of finance that are required, right? And to also make sure that the private sector financiers are interested and attracted and engaged with this. And I think that very much relates to your second question, Amy. The role of private finance is massive, because there's, even if we would manage to do all the reforms in the international financial architecture, I mean, for example, from the MDBs, if we would do all the CAF recommendations and the SDR rechanneling and many other things, that wouldn't be enough, because there's not enough public money worldwide in order to fund the transition globally. As Alden was saying, now the geopolitical context is shifting, and that is creating new pressures in budgets, both in developed countries, but also in developing countries. We're seeing also slashing of ODA budgets and so on. So even more so, their role is really important. And so it's key that they're part of the conversation since the very beginning, but it's also key that in that conversation, countries make sure to create the enabling environment to both bring them in, but also to make sure that there is less dependency on public money, although public money is absolutely crucial and it will be required, right? So yeah, but I think here, Leo, if you want to complement.
I guess the one thing I would add to that is to say that the jet piece started with the politics, and that's part of the reason they got so much traction. They had heads of state, they had big kind of lottery winners checks with gigantic billion-dollar figures on them, but then they had to work out what the plans were, and that meant then figuring out how to bring stakeholders around the table, build out project pipelines, figure out what was public, what was private, what was international. And that process didn't work as effectively as we would have hoped it did, because it came after the politics. I think the thing that I would flag with the next generation of country platforms is that high-level political momentum is still essential. Otherwise, you end up with something that becomes a purely technocratic exercise. So we're seeing that the country platforms are going to have the right capacities and actors in the right places to be able to bring in technical expertise, financial expertise, but we are still going to need to see heads of state and energy ministers and finance ministers backing these things so that they don't end up sitting on shelves a year or two down the line. Alden, back
Laura,
to you.
do you want to come back in on Juan's question on the tax convention?
Yeah, sure. So let me just find it again. What are the news regarding the UN tax convention? So, I mean, as you know, there was this big initiative that was brought on by the UN and also championed personally by the UNSG that seek to be a little bit more inclusive, because I think in the other fora where tax was being discussed, not all countries are involved, right? For example, in the OECD. So the terms of reference for that effort were already negotiated ahead of the UNGA and New York Climate Week, and they were adopted overwhelmingly. So I think it is there's a lot to be done still, but let's say that the adoption of those terms of reference is I think quite a positive sign. In terms of the role that these potential, if we would get to the point of agreeing on some tax that could be used in order to fund certain initiatives, for example environmental investments, that would be quite positive, because it would essentially mean that we would be enlarging the pie, right? We're talking about finance and the need for finance and how finance is constrained, and so new revenue sources like coming from these taxes will essentially just mean there will be more money that could be allocated to different things. I say this with a little caution, because it wouldn't be an easy process. I mean, taxation is a sovereign issue, and it's not as simple as to say, okay, we're going to raise that and we're going to be able to just transfer it from one thing to the other. It would not be the case. For example, in the case of the IMO, the maritime levy, that could happen because it could be collected by the IMO, and that would create a whole other mechanism. But I think even though that's the case, it's definitely a positive step that this has now been adopted, and let's see where it takes us. There's enough momentum, but I think piggybacking on what Leo was saying, there is good momentum. We now need to see how this translates into concrete action, right? So whether countries will be able to adopt this, how this will play out, and what will be the mechanism if this is actually possible, and so on.
Okay, I see that Sarah had a hand raised. Sarah, are you still with us? Do you want to ask your question live? Okay, Sarah might have had to drop off. Sorry about that. Nadia, you
I
can
think
let.
she wrote it, Alden, sorry, the last question.
Okay, let's see if. Okay, here we go. Yeah, I mean, as I said, increased public funding is critical. It's the sort of core of trust in the system and political intent by the developed countries, and it also is critical for leveraging private finance. So what a meaningful increase looks like, that is the hub of the political discussions. Everyone agrees it needs to be more than 100 billion. Some have laid out sort of an aspirational goal of $1 trillion. There are different positions from different of the developing country regional groupings in the negotiations. But that has to be put through the acid test of what the core developed countries think is achievable, that they're willing to put themselves on the hook for. Because, you know, they've gotten a lot of criticism for falling short until just last year on the $100 billion commitment they made in Copenhagen in 2009. They don't want to repeat that exercise. Every one of them I've talked to has made it clear they want to be able to deliver what they promised this time around. So that's the core of the issue. If you look at the US, you've got not only the election uncertainty, but the opposition of most in the Republican Party to scaling up international climate finance. If you look at Europe, 70% of Europe's climate finance, which is nearly $30 billion a year, comes from just two countries, France and Germany. And they are both in political turmoil internally, and they both have resistance from some elements of their polity on scaling up finance, much less maintaining it. UK, Leo can speak to, but there's questions about the challenges the new Labour government is facing on the fiscal front and being able to move towards restoring 0.7% of ODA as a target and scaling up climate finance. And that leaves Japan, Norway, a handful of others. So there are huge challenges on this front into matching the need for increased public finance and the minimum that developing countries may be willing to accept in a deal, and the maximum that developed countries are willing to put themselves on a hook for. So we'll see. And sort of answering one of the other questions, I think we will also be looking for progress out of this at the NCQG and pre-COP ministerials in Baku next week. I don't expect any preliminary agreements on these issues. They're all related to each other. They are all massively political. The size of the commitment, the contributor base and who's on the hook for it, the access issues, the accounting and reporting issues, the adaptation and loss and damage sub-goals, these are all intensely political issues. They're related to each other. And as I said, I think the good news is the ministers are coming up to speed, wrapping their heads around it, understanding the issues, starting to understand where each other are coming from and their must-haves and their red lines. But I don't expect any puff of white smoke out of Baku next week with a preliminary deal. I think that's going to come in the end game during the second week when ministers are together in Baku for the negotiations. And as I said, it may be influenced by signals out of the G20 Leaders Summit an ocean away in Rio that same week. Let me just see if Leo or Laura want to come in on those issues. If not, I'll go to Leo on the fossil related issue from Lori. Anything more you wanted to say on the NCQG and finance front, or can we pivot back to fossil fuels? Okay, Leo.
Thanks, Alden. So I'll try to take Laurie's question and the second part of your question in one. I guess the answer to your question first, Sarah, is it does not send a good signal. So sorry, Sarah's second question was what signal does it send that countries, particularly Azerbaijan and the UAE, aren't reiterating support for the transition away from fossil fuels? Is really not a good signal. The rhetoric that comes from the COP Troika is extremely dominant, whichever countries it's made up of. So they lead on this issue, they frame the debate, and it's not the case at all so far that we're seeing leadership from them on fossil fuel phase out, quite the opposite. And to your question, Laurie, I guess when you're asking, is there any way remaining to genuinely build commitment around fossil fuel phase out, the answer is finance. It's around demonstrating both within and outside the COP that there is sufficient public, truly concessional or grant finance being made available to countries in the global south. I think there's a key challenge, which is around the interplay between action to decarbonize the power sector. So fossil fuel phase out, meaning we stop burning fossil fuels, we stop end coal power stations, stop burning gas for electricity, and then the action to end the production of fossil fuels. And these have very different ways of working, different forms of diplomacy, and different levels of difficulty. There's growing momentum around clean power finance, which is great. There's much more money flowing into renewables, which will push fossil fuels off the system. But there's not sufficient money available or mechanisms available to deliver fossil fuel phase out more broadly, or to figure out how to end the production of fossil fuels, particularly for vulnerable producer countries in the global south. So we need to see this coming through at COP29. It needs to be in evidence both inside the negotiations, so through the NCQG, but also with strong signals outside, so to demonstrate to countries that there is money available and that it's not just promises, it's actual money flowing. And I think that outside piece is really important. We need to see existing alliances and mechanisms showing how they're mobilizing significantly scaled up funding. A good example would be the Coal Transition Commission, which was announced by the French government at COP28, which is looking to figure out how to finance the early retirement of coal power projects in the global south. So these initiatives do exist, but they're not currently acting as more than the sum of their parts and communicating a really clear, compelling vision, which is that money is available, mechanisms are available for channeling it to actually deliver on fossil fuel phase out. That's, as far as I can see, the only real route to building momentum around fossil fuel phase out.
Great. Let me maybe field the questions from Will and Oscar on adaptation finance, and then Laura, I'll ask you to come in on Jake's question about COP16 biodiversity and the crossover there between the COPs, and also Amy's question about Bridgetown 3.0 and the V20. On adaptation finance, as I said, I think it's quite likely that you will see something on adaptation finance in the NCQG decision. Whether it's a concrete quantitative sub-goal, I think remains to be seen. As I said, in Glasgow, developed countries did commit to double adaptation finance to $40 billion a year by next year. There will be a report on that coming out in advance of the COP on how they are doing. There will be discussions of that at the COP, but clearly that amount would not satisfy developing countries in the NCQG. They've been fighting for 50% of finance to be allocated towards adaptation. If you assume that the quantum is going to be hopefully significantly larger than 100 billion a year, 40 billion a year for adaptation finance doesn't satisfy the demand. How they address that remains to be seen, but that is a focus of a lot of work, a lot of discussions, including in New York last week. I think the broader path forward on adaptation and resilience finance is also important here. There have been discussions about how to mobilize more finance. We can provide more of the details, and I can refer you to my colleague Ana Mulio, who helped drive some of those climate and development ministerial conversations last week in New York around adaptation finance mobilization. Making it attractive to private finance is also a part of this. I mean, the line between mitigation and adaptation finance is sometimes blurry. Investment in new agricultural practices and systems is both mitigation in terms of reducing methane and carbon emissions, and also building resilience. Similarly, with infrastructure investments, they need to be made to advance development goals and prosperity and reduce emissions, but they also need to be done in a climate resilient way, as we're now seeing here in results from the flooding from Hurricane Helene in the US, for example. So yes, this is being discussed. The investment opportunities are not always as clear as they are in the mitigation space, but I think there's more interest in driving private sector money into this. Laura, do you want to come in on COP16 and biodiversity and also Bridgetown and the V20?
Yeah, just very briefly on Oscar's question. I think one of the key points to keep in mind is that adaptation is very local. It's very context specific. So I think that is at the heart of why it also makes it so hard to, like create, let's say, the same financial flows that perhaps mitigation has. Not to mention, of course, that with mitigation you can have a business case, and with adaptation it's not impossible, but it's smaller scale solutions. So the ticket sizes are smaller, and it's because of that less attractive for financial institutions. This is why I think national transition planning and the idea of country platforms around adaptation can also be quite beneficial, because then it will essentially enable the creation of a pipeline of projects of adaptation, and that will reduce transaction costs, and it will be easier to pull, let's say, people together, financiers together, and spread out the risk. Also, on your question of infrastructure, Oscar, I think there is a lot that can be done for adaptation and infrastructure, which would be bigger ticket sizes for financial institutions. And I think the MDBs have a huge role to play there, right? So to make sure that they're screening for opportunities for adaptation solutions in infrastructure projects. So I think there is more that we can do on that. But there's definitely a role for the private sector there, not only for philanthropy and public money. Very briefly on COP16. Yes, so COP16 will be, this year we actually have the 3 COPs, so we also have the certification COP, so it's actually quite special, but at least in the intersection of nature and climate, we did have text on, I agree there is more of a convergence on both agendas, which is super necessary, because they're, of course, we know it's not the same, but they're highly interrelated. Colombia is very keen to create that link. From what we are seeing, there is a lot of push to connect the moments. I think we have some text on the GST on nature and adaptation, and we had a nature day for the first time, I think, a couple of years ago in Sharm, and now it's becoming like a regular feature. So we could expect something along the lines, but I think as of now it's uncertain. What we will see, or what I will say, is that it will be a very smart choice, because we are in the run-up to COP30, which will happen in the Amazon, and that will be also another key topic, right? The nature agenda, especially happening in the heart of the Amazon, it's something to watch out for. So it would be very, I would say, convenient and smart for both presidencies to try and seek to create that connection beyond what we're going to see in the normal text. And then on Amy's question on the B20 and the Bridgetown agenda. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think it's incredible that now Prime Minister Motley, she's been a champion. Everybody knows that she has taken over the chair of the B20. So that will certainly help turbocharge, let's say, some of the work that has been happening with the Bridgetown agenda. I mentioned very early, it has been launched. I think there's a lot to highlight there, but perhaps the one thing that I zoomed in was the SDRs, and that already collected a lot of support from vulnerable countries. So I think the creation and the crystallization of that coalition, having Mia Motley at its helm, will definitely help. And I do believe that Global North leaders are listening. I think one of the things that need to happen, and why it's so useful that now Prime Minister Motley is chairing this initiative, is perhaps the convergence of all of this agenda. Now, we know that the B20 had the Accra to Marrakesh agenda, then there was also Bridgetown. So, perhaps what we will see is more and more, let's say, unification and coalition building that will help land some of those messages.
Thanks a lot, Laura. And I'll just take a quick pass at Nick's question on the meeting next week in Baku. I mean, as I said, I think it's critical that the ministers continue to identify possible landing zones, come up the learning curve on the issues at stake and the political dynamics. I don't expect there to be any significant announcement of details and decisions on even some of the lower level political aspects of it. It's going to be a package deal, as I said, but we do need to see progress next week. We will then have a text from the 2 negotiating leads coming in between that ministerial meeting and the COP for parties to start looking at. We will then have engagement during the first week of the COP at the negotiator level on that text. We will have continued consultations between Ministers Bowen and Fuad, with other ministers and ministerial pairings and groupings in the run-up to Baku, but the end game is going to be all to play for here. probably, and I would predict this, that the COP will not adjourn at 5 p.m. On Friday, on November 23rd. It will spill over November 22nd. It will spill over into that Saturday at least, and hopefully not into Sunday, as some COPs have. But this is a very tough deal. It's laying the groundwork for the whole finance architecture of Paris for the coming decade or more. So it's going to be a tough decision. So we've at time, but let me just say, first of all, thank you to Laura and Leo for joining us today. Thank you to Dido and Ria and others on the E3G communications team for setting this up. Thanks to all of you for attending. There is a recording of the conversation, which is available to you. We also have a WhatsApp media briefing service that keeps you in the loop on developments, not just on what we've talked about, but the overall geopolitical landscape around climate. If you're not subscribed to that, just reach out to press@e3g.org to be added to that list. And also, if you have any follow-up inquiries, or your colleagues do, after you've shared this with them, feel free to get in touch with our communications team at that email address, and we'll try to get back to you in a timely way. So thanks again to everyone, and have a good rest of your week.